Hello, all you dreamers, optimists, and junior tomorrownauts. Welcome back to the Tomorrowland Times podcast, the unofficial home for fans of Disney's 2015 Tomorrowland movie, its prequel novel, Before Tomorrowland, and the alternate reality game that introduced us to its fictional universe all the way back in 2013, The Optimist. I'm Nick.
And I'm Hastin, and today we're continuing our limited series on the show, the Before Tomorrowland Book Club, celebrating the 10th anniversary of the prequel novel written by Jeff Jensen and Jonathan Case.
We covered the book's thrilling conclusion last week, but now it's time to wind down this adventure by diving into the epilogue, and then we'll take a look back at the story as a whole and its overall connections with the film. But before we close this book for good, we've got some follow-up and a special announcement.
A special announcement?
That's right, but first let's start with some follow-up. Hastin, by goodness, you made a wonderful discovery. One of those questions that we put out into the universe. We thought maybe a listener would answer it, but it was you. You answered the question, did our brick actually get installed at Wardenclyffe?
And the answer is yes. And
Woohoo!
To our visual listeners, we have a photo of it. I did
wonderful.
not realize that all the bricks were installed, that they took photos. I think maybe the most ARG-like thing is that for some reason our brick with the bricks around it is installed upside down.
Oh yeah,
I
it's
love
even
this.
more mysterious. There's an extra layer of mystery around our brick, which now we should have the opportunity to compare and contrast. It does say a tribute to my fellows, which was a plaque that existed in the digital extension of the Optimist alternate reality game where they did Edison Square, and there was a great statue of Tesla, and at the base, maybe even one of the earlier looks at the Plus U logo with that dual color pattern, the black and the red. And it's this beautiful gold plaque. So we thought, hey, if we're going to put a brick with the Tesla center at the Wardenclyffe site, we've got to do that particular saying.
Well, and for those that remember, however long we've been doing this, our friend Charles, who originally was one of the hosts of this, not even this podcast, but the
Yes, the one that precipitated this, called Tomorrow Chat. They were live, only live, never pre-recorded.
That's right.
Yes.
They were live, and he was the one who made the effort to order the brick, given
That's
I
right.
think it was shared by the Oatmeal at the time, who also shared the whole thing about the Plus Ultra story and whatever else.
After all these years, it's so great to see it and to have proof. You know, I still want to go visit it and see it with my own two eyes, maybe take a thin sheet of paper and a crayon so I can do a little rubbing of it for myself, frame that up on the Tomorrowland wall here in the office. I say here in the office, but naturally I am broadcasting from the middle of the wheat field, from the other dimension, of course. But that brings us to our special announcement, very exciting. I thought maybe I would save this for our next episode, which will be an anniversary celebration episode, but you know what? We've got to do it now. Everything has aligned. We are doing something that has been asked of us by popular demand in a couple of different ways, folks. And in order to do it, I'm going to have to reach back. I'm going to plunge into the wheat. I got to fumble into the wheat behind me. That's right, folks. It is the 10th anniversary Tomorrowland pin. That logo you've seen open us up on each episode here, the little one next to the Tomorrowland logo making a 10, it is now available as a pin, but it's not just a pin, folks.
It hides a secret, doesn't it?
Oh, it hides a secret, and a secret that I say makes it more than just a pin set in a way, because yes, folks have been asking if they could get a 10th anniversary commemorative logo pin. Now you will be able to do that. There was also another pin that was our most asked for replica that no one's ever done in an accurate scale, and that is the 1964 pin that appears in the film that Athena gives to young Frank. The one that Funko did back in the day, it was way too big. It was huge. We know that the originals were 1 inch across, and
we
that's
saw
it.
them with our own eyes.
And they've got this beautiful clear epoxy dome on top that goes on top of the enamel, colors underneath. Very cool, very retro. And folks, I'm happy to tell you, this is a 2-layer pass-through pin. You take off the 10, and here you have it. A beautiful 1/1 scale replica of the 1964 pin. You get 2 pins for the price of one. an option that can't be beat. And I wanted to make sure that those who are listening to this podcast got the first crack at getting these. We have a very limited number. The link to the Etsy listing will be in the description of this episode. We're not really sure if we're going to be able to do a second run. So I would say if this is something that you would like to get your hands on, don't hesitate. I just wanted to mention it here. We're going to wait another day to post it wide on the rest of our social media accounts for the rest of the fans. But for those who have actually been listening and following along, we're so appreciative of you. And we want to make sure you had the first crack at that. I am so, so, so excited that they turned out so well.
Nick, you've outdone yourself as usual.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, it's really just you give the people what they ask for. When the people demand it, you must give it to them, even if it's not that many people. That's enough preamble. Let's dig back into this wonderful book. We've got the epilogue, 1952. It's called Graceland, in quotation marks, in which a better future is built. Outside of an aircraft marked Tesla in big letters, crashed in an alien landscape, Amelia Earhart has a wound stitched up by a young doctor. It's Lee, now over 30 years old. Amelia notices Clara's sketchbook next to his medical kit in his backpack. Her crew of a dozen marches through an alien jungle filled with strange wildlife. She remembers eating them all when she was stranded here with the Faustus, and that's when we learn that she lost the vote to keep the Faustus units active during the war. They were all incinerated, and she had cried her tears for them. Over the last year, Plus Ultra had built a new tower in the Himalayas to survey the other world, finding the last thing they would have expected, a faint pulse of uranium. Making their way out of the jungle and over the slope to a seaside cliff, Amelia and her crew spot him. Henry! His body now weathered, oxidized, and scratched. Lee approaches him and speaks his name. Henry's eyes pulse on dimly, responding in a voice Amelia thought sounded closer to his childhood self. He had saved a little power just for the occasion. He had hoped it would be Clara, but he learns that she didn't make it. He apologizes to Amelia for killing her all those years ago, and Lee laughs at his joke. Henry points their gaze across a neighboring valley with a mountain on the other side. At the bottom of the valley, a gleaming structure unlike anything Plus Ultra had ever built. Arched pathways and platforms swarming with unique robots, all building new towers, new ships, and more of themselves. Lee was shocked. He pulled out his mother's sketchbook and flipped to a page in the middle. On it, a watercolor rendering of the city that now stood before them. I was inspired. Build your future, boy. Make her proud. And then Henry was gone, a statue. Amelia says, "You heard the man. Let's get to work." And thus ends Before Tomorrowland, the final movements of the epilogue. And boy, do I get goosebumps just thinking about it. They're throwing in things from the earlier in the book. We saw Clara do her sketches, and now Henry, having merely just scanned those sketches, that one moment when they were in the elevator, locked in his memory banks, left with nothing to do on the other side, goes to her inspiration and takes what we now know was the first stand at the gleaming city of Tomorrowland. Not necessarily the city we see here, but the version 1.0, and probably the one that gave us this look, this beautiful, sloping, curving archways and pathways that we see now. It all came from someone who ultimately wasn't even Plus Ultra. It was Clara. And by gum, do I love that. I love where we end this. Hastin.
I was convinced 10 years ago that, like, okay, we're at the end of this story of the chapter. This is going to move us right into the film. I think the thing that I sort of relate to the most is that, you know, Lee was a young boy in the main story. And here he is, you know, kind of a 30 something, like on the brink of what the future of Tomorrowland is, the future of Plus Ultra, right? You know, we're 12 years out from what was supposed to be another reveal that didn't happen. Or no, we're 12 years out from the World's Fair, which kicked off another 20-year reveal. You know, it's one of those things where I can't help but feel, with the first time I read this, I've now read a book for this thing that I experienced and that I got to be a part of and that I loved. This is just this next part of it, and I can't wait for the future parts. And in a way, I kind of felt like, oh my God, in a few months, I get to be Lee. And like, I got to do this early experience and get, you know, pulled into this game that was it, and now I've read this story of the back end, and like now I'm getting ready to get pulled into it, and oh man, everything just felt so exciting at that point. And I think 10 years later, I appreciate the story leading up to this a lot more than I did 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I was hooked on the start and the end of this book, and the middle parts were just kind of lore to me. And, Henry's story was interesting, but I didn't really super care about it as much as I thought I would. And now it's like 10 years later, and knowing the trajectory of sort of what we got, The Optimist, this book, the movie, it's like I appreciate this story and this overall, trajectory that happened, and the historical details, and the first science fiction convention, and all of these little fun aspects and how it played out, and the whole humanism and robots thing. And it felt so much more satisfying this time around, 10 years discovering it, not thinking about this bright and gleaming future that might be out there, but thinking about, oh, this is a really nice little package of things that we got, this sort of perfect, at least for us, this sort of perfect trilogy of The Optimist, this amazing book, and the movie that we love.
And all those little payoffs here that don't just tie into the film, but are self-contained references to the entirety of the rest of the book. And I love here seeing Lee and what he has become, even if it's just the smallest glimpse in the epilogue, because he did take inspiration from his mother, not in the same way Henry did. We've got two characters here who took inspiration from Clara. Henry in the more obvious optimistic way. But when you think about Lee becoming a doctor, he wasn't able to save his mother. No one could, not even Plus Ultra. And now he's a doctor and he's walking that path and he has that personal connection with what he's doing, and he's doing it for Plus Ultra. This is a fantastic journey for him, and I can't help but wonder, where he goes from here, what kind of adventures post 1952, where we are here, that him and Amelia would go on before the great cataclysm that Nyx would bring onto Plus Ultra in the film. It's just so satisfying. And we've got a couple fun little details I want to call out here in this very short epilogue. I like that they call out that Amelia has a new MFD. And even though she's only like 55 years old here, she's got a little bit of that, I can't, and the specific description of a touchscreen that she struggles with the simulated button. I love this idea because that conversation between a tactile pressing button and a screen button, this is straight out of our world. And I love to see Amelia Earhart, of all people, also struggling with that.
And I also love when you think about when the book came out 10 years ago, a lot more of a recent transition for a lot of people than it is today. It was like in 2015, a touch screen in your pocket felt extremely nascent to most people and felt like a brand new thing and whatever else. Smartphones were still relatively new in 2014, 2015. It's kind of fun to think about, oh, that was reflecting also a feeling at the time that now feels even more fun a decade later.
Yeah, Amelia just wants her BlackBerry back.
Exactly.
A few little emotional details that just really landed with me here. I love that Henry's final words, we always look to the final words of a character to sum up either what that character's perspective was, what sort of themes they represented. But there's a metatextual level on top of this one here. Because when Henry says, I was inspired, build your future, boy, make her proud, that's a direct quote of the dedication at the beginning of the book. That's what Jeff Jensen said to his children that he dedicated the book to, make her proud. So we've got, in addition to just this beautifully emotional moment within the context of the story, now here at the very, very end, reaching back out past the proscenium and wrapping you back into it, settling onto what the theme of this book is playing with. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But on that level, I love the journey of Amelia and the journey of the book's relationship to the idea of an artificial being and this whole franchise's perspective on artificial beings. And it's subtle, but just the wording of it. She says, you heard the man, let's get to work. Her calling him a man, especially a character who was dealing with some level of arrested development, and it had this drama of being a child trapped in an adult body, saying in his exile, in his work, in his ability to take inspiration from another human and enact their vision in their honor, doing exactly what he just said, he became a man at the end. And it's just so satisfying, even though ultimately he only had that last gasp of energy left. And this was now he is his own statue. He it left as a monument. And I would just love to have had a moment where if this franchise had gone into the future, that we could have, in a future sequel or TV show or something, they could have waded out into the early frontiers of the land and someone stumbled upon the statue in the modern day. That would have just been fabulous. We also are so lucky we've been treated to one final piece of chapter art by Jonathan Case. What do we got here, Haston? What am I looking at?
It's one of my favorites. You've got this crashed aircraft named the Tesla with two small figures right in front. We assume that that's Amelia and Lee coming out and exploring that other world. I love this otherworldly creature. I'm a little sad after reading the book and hearing the descriptions of these that none of that sort of wild nature of the other world made it into the movie. And I think that if there would have been an aspect of it that would have, maybe it would have connected more with people that it's like, oh, this isn't necessarily a place on Earth, or, this isn't a or alternate dimension or whatever else. It's a really neat kind of final wrap up. And I love that there's this horizon out. There's this kind of billowing smoke, which is the common theme that we've seen in all this casework. There's this horizon out there with a few rocky spires, out in the background that are just like it pulls your eyes in, and it's like, this is where we're building the future. This is where Henry is building the future.
I like that you pointed out the sort of difference in the visuals of how the other dimension is described, because I think it is initially their way to differentiate what you're seeing here. We're not describing a wheat field necessarily. We're describing other topography, and it's a way of defining it. Like, this is an early iteration. What you saw in the movie is somewhere else. But emotionally, the difference is down to what the media we're reading is. This book calls back to the old pulp science fiction novels that you would have seen a wild landscape like that. And the film very directly, admitted by Brad Bird, he wanted to play more in the fabulistic world of the Wizard of Oz and fairy tales. And so the visuals they chose for the other world sort of corresponded to what media they were in at the time. And honestly, it just says this place is infinite. Remember, it's a whole globe. It's a whole globe of what you're seeing. And if there is some kind of one-to-one relationship, which they imply but maybe don't necessarily say outright that there's a one-to-one relationship, it's simply the difference of they're crossing over in New York. Casey crosses over in
Florida.
Well, when she touches the pin, she's in Florida. She sees the commercial, but they all see the commercial in different places. They're in Paris, right?
Right. But they also fly out to the edge of the earth. We don't know how much they rotate the earth. Yeah.
This is a great question. We are now going to cut to a clip from the film where the rocket is piercing back through the veil and we see Earth. We're going to determine what it is, where it is.
Why are we going back?
We're not. We're going through to another dimension.
So we blasted into outer space just to get a running start?
This part may get a little weird.
I can't tell what it is. So I can't tell what city that's supposed to represent. So if any sharp-eyed listeners can determine which landscape of night lights shining out of the city it is when they're punching through to Tomorrowland finally in the film's final act, go ahead and write in and we'll feature you there. But to my eyes, I am completely unable to determine what that is. I can't believe we're also at our final installment of Fact versus Fiction.
And how would you convince them? Data? Facts? Good luck.
I'm left with many questions. This chapter itself called Graceland. Is this an Elvis reference? This was my question. From the minute she said it at the beginning, I said, Graceland, is that an Elvis reference? And then I thought, well, why did Elvis name it Graceland? Is this there's some meaning here? Took a very short amount of time to look it up. No, it could not have possibly been an Elvis reference because Graceland, not only not named by Elvis, but he didn't even buy it until 1957. So 5 years after the epilogue even. So when Clara earlier in the book says that she thinks a utopia should be called Graceland, it's distinctly possible that she is literally just talking about the combination of those two words, grace and land.
I mean, from a naming perspective, Tomorrowland feels about the same. We want a space to explore the future.
I took this as a challenge, though. I thought, okay, well, what's the oldest reference to the word Graceland that I can find? I did a little bit of research here, and if anyone has an earlier one than this, let me know. But the earliest I could find in the newspaper archive was to Graceland Cemetery in Chicago, which was a private cemetery that was established in 1860. So if anyone finds anything earlier than that, let me know. I really thought I had found something in like the 1500s, but when I pulled up the document, it was Grace/land, and the search engine thought that the slash was an L. This is minutia we're getting lost in. The earliest instance is interesting, but the really interesting thing is if anyone has an idea based on what we know of Clara and Lee's backstory, why she might have been inspired to call it Graceland. I mean, other than just Grace and land, they sound good next to each other. If there is some kind of historical precedent or literary precedent, please do write in. I'd be very curious about that because it was an offhanded comment earlier in the book, but when you name your epilogue after that offhanded comment, okay, now I'm really thinking I need to dig in here. This is very interesting.
Advanced reader copy. It had a different name, didn't it? It used Lee's name of what he felt the land should be called, Betterburg.
Betterburg. We all love Betterburg, but it's a little more flippant, a little more fun, a little more silly because he didn't really care to think about it. I kind of like to think this was an effort to shift the emphasis from Lee to Clara. I mean, obviously, everything in this epilogue is stacked towards making us think about her and learning her ultimate fate and everything else. But obviously, Graceland, the better choice. As much as we love a good laugh and throwing back to that, I'm sure Amelia got a chuckle out of it. Graceland is the sweeter ending, and I like ending on a nice, sweet little note because as fun and adventurous as this epilogue is, also very, very heartwarming, especially right at the very end.
Well, when you think about what Jeff was going through with his wife at the time and whatever else, like what an amazing and just awesome tribute to her and the children that they had, her trajectory and her story and everything else. And it's really sweet. It's really sweet knowing that there was a big, strong personal connection behind it as well. And no matter how it ended up working out for them, it's like he had an amazing trajectory of her in the book. I really can't help but think about him and the experience that he had with his wife at the end of this.
And it's really the perfect, even if it did come from a very personal place, it perfectly dovetailed into what ultimately becomes the theme of the book. And that's why I'd like to move us into our next segment here. Let's look back at the whole book as a whole. We've appreciated the epilogue so thoroughly. I start with the themes. I start with the takeaways. Like, what am I going to walk away with? And especially, if we can put it in context of how everything in the book built up, if it is this stack of dominoes that leads up to the epilogue, what is the period at the end of the sentence that I just say, I'm going to take this in with me? And the thing that comes out, particularly with regard to Clara and her story, is this idea of when we imagine the future, what lens are we going to imagine the future through? Is it through the lens of the economy? Is it through the lens of necessity? Is it through survival? Any number of lenses. And the book, and I think by extension, of course, the film later, it's postulating the idea that we must see it through the lens of people, or maybe even just a particularly inspirational person that's personal to us, in the same way that Clara ended up being personal to Henry. That idea of human connection as the basis of futurism, that's the thing I think I'll walk away with. And not just as like, oh, wow, what a great timeless theme for this book, but something to apply to your real life now, something you actually can carry with you. And even in the macro and the micro ways, how do you allow human connection to be the emphasis of your envisioning of the future and therefore the steps you're going to take to get there? Are we allowing it to be that?
Remember, there was the robot uprising, which was an absolute disaster for Plus Ultra in the past, to the point where they lost everything and they had to escape and whatever else. But thanks to Henry understanding that human machine connection, he was able to take the next generation of robots and actually build Clara's vision and build a vision and not just deal with this, with this fighting and this strife. And I've just been going through this sort of feeling of what we are seeing in our sort of human society currently with the rise of AI and everything else, and how there's this distinctly unhuman factor to it. We keep talking about how there are aspects of it that are going to benefit humanity, and I think there will be. But there's also this broken aspect of it. Kind of feels like that there's this like rise of the robot sort of war thing, and I wish we really had a Henry that was like understood how we can use this to truly build the human psyche instead of trying to replace it or augment it or cancel it or whatever else, which feels like the sort of current trend in the tech world that we exist in today. So I found that sort of duality between, oh, this wasn't the robot uprising, he did it, and then also how that related to kind of the themes of today.
Yeah, absolutely. And what did it take to get to the positive outcome? Because ultimately, it is a robot uprising to the degree that when they look out, they see robots making robots and doing these things, but they're guided by this principle. And we don't get a great deal of insight into what caused the robot uprising of the past. We get some throwaway lines about it.
Right.
But that's why that would be such a fascinating story, because if you told that story, then you could make a contrast to this, which is it was him reconnecting with his humanity that allowed him to do the positive version of a robot uprising, which is constructive rather than destructive. I think we can take from context clues that the robot uprising in the past was a destructive uprising.
Right. And I think that it's a big part of futurism that doesn't exist today. That we are at this weird precipice of like maybe for the first time in human history, we're not necessarily thinking about the future, about how it actually benefits humans. We're in this like capitalism kind of mindset. We're in this. And so it was a real, just refreshing take to kind of remember what this is supposed to be about.
If Plus Ultra still existed, Howard Hughes is running it in our world.
When you think about the book and the type of futurism that it's selling us and sort of where we are today and what futurism is selling us today, for lack of a better term, it's like that last scene in the Carousel of Progress. What would it be today? Through its past, even through the current version that exists that was created in the 90s as kind of a parody, there's a humanism aspect to it. We don't really see today's AI models and today's like advanced tech and whatever really, giving us that ability to create this sort of human connection and this like, no, let the robots do the work so that I can have more enjoyment and leisure time, right? That was the sort of promise of the future that we were sold, is the humanism was more time for you, more time to connect with family, more time to create these relationships, to have this humanism connection. And so coming back to the book and like seeing that, human connection being a strong part of what the overall story is, and then how that connects to the film kind of stating the same message. It's like, oh man, compared to 10 years ago, that really feels missing now.
No, and there are some explicit quotes I remember from the promotional period around the film where Damon Lindelof was speaking to these things and sort of a new way of looking at AI. Like, the film doesn't say AI, but on the promotional tour, they absolutely referred to Athena and the Dave Clarks as an AI. And the idea of those two ways of looking at it contrasting each other. And Brad Bird even threw in his concept of whoever made Athena made her as an act of love. They don't go into who made her in the film, but she was made as an act of love. And so clearly she was one of those projects where budget was no problem. And in his mind, even if it never made it into the film, the Dave Clarks, in their need for dozens and dozens and dozens of them, were done on the cheap. The idea that they there was no love being put into the Dave Clarks in the same way that there was love being put into Athena's. So the other thing I kind of walk away with when I sort of sit and think back on the whole book and sort of its place as a certain type of historical fiction, a genre of historical fiction that I've grown to enjoy. I also think of something like Inglourious Bastards by Quentin Tarantino, where the big spoiler alert, skip ahead 10 seconds if you don't want to hear this, they kill Hitler at the end in a spectacular fashion that is this sort of release, this sort of the idea of literary justice for things in history that were never truly corrected. It's a corrective type of historical fiction. And there's a little taste of this here. The main thrust of the history is compatible with real history in this book, but there's just these little aspects of the science fiction element that to me have this really wonderful bit of literary justice for historical wrongs. Like, it's really sad when you read about how Tesla ended his life, how Tesla spent the end of his life. And so to have this alternate history offer a little bit of justice for someone like Tesla, and then maybe on the other side of that, having Howard Hughes finally get told off by someone in a piece of historical fiction. These are just nice things to have, and they're comforting. Our historical fiction doesn't just have to live in the margins. It can also offer us this alternate view as a way of saying we acknowledge that this wasn't right, and that if we have control over these pocket universes that aren't literal pocket universes, but they are books in our pockets, why not have these opportunities to give Tesla this fantastic, meaningful, connected last chapter of his life?
And as we've talked about before, weirdly, in our overall forms of entertainment, this keeps happening. And I don't know, there's just part of me that kind of loves that too, of yeah, you get this sort of alternate vision of him that he may not have got what he wanted, but he had more impact than he had in the real life. And I sort of love that.
I feel like we've almost completely talked about this book without invoking the heaviness that comes now with using the word Tesla. But this book is talking about the real man. And so we've had this opportunity to just explore the purity of that exists 10 years ago when this book came out, and we don't have to deal with all of the hectic revelations that we wake up to every morning in the newspaper.
The big thing that I give the book as a whole is, and I give the movie this too, but really the book, you think about what this Tomorrowland IP should have been, what it could have been. And it could have been extremely just, oh, there's this city of the future and you're invited, like the theme park land, right? And I think to have this backstory and to have this, the place is not really the purpose of these stories. The place exists to motivate us to be better human beings and to be a better person and to look at things differently and whatever else is ultimately, I think, the ultimate sort of goal of what futurism should be, and not just come and see the latest robot vacuum, come and see it's not a Best Buy showroom. It's who we are as human beings, how we interact and how we connect with people and robots and algorithms and whatever else, and what humanism exists there or not. The book, from a very unique perspective, could have easily just been, hey, these 4 cool guys are building the city of the future and you're invited. But instead it becomes this complex, story about humanism and how we connect as people. A son who's not into it connects with his mother, and, it's just, again, it could have been so easy, and it wasn't. It was this deep, complex look. And honestly, looking back 10 years later, not sure if a concept like this, relating to a theme park thing could exist. You're not going to get, I don't think in today's era, you're going to get a Haunted Mansion book that would look at, well, why do we process horror and death and whatever else the way that we do? And this film does process what we think about futurism, how we interpret it, how we digest it, what it means. And it feels so unique for what its origins are.
Like many of the greatest pieces of pure, true science fiction, not science fantasy, not space fantasy, not space opera, true science fiction often gets levied this criticism that it is too cerebral, even though that is at the core of what science fiction is. And I think, to what you're speaking to, these are cerebral concepts of not let's literally adapt a land, which I would also like to see what a literal adaptation of a land looks like. Like, rides have stories, but most lands don't have stories. Some lands do have stories, but Tomorrowland doesn't have a literal plot. And so you kind of had to go cerebral. If you were going to say, let's do something about Tomorrowland, a literal kind of like, oh, well, maybe it's a Space Mountain movie or this, that, or the other. It's never really going to live up to the promise of those two words smashed together. Just tomorrow and land. And Brad Bird loved to talk about that again on the press tour. He was always talking about, tomorrow, it's not here, it's out there, you're reaching for it. And then land, terra firma, it's firm. So it's this way out there idea and this really hard idea smashed right up next to each other. And yeah, it's naturally, if you're doing the idea justice, it is going to be a cerebral experience. And for the people who didn't want Tomorrowland to be that, I just kindly invite you to go watch Meet the Robinsons, and please stop talking about this movie, because this movie is trying to do something more ambitious than that. And indeed, as you pointed out, the book is trying to do something more ambitious than that. It is not a prequel to the degree that you have these literal plot threads that go from A to B, like, oh, let's explain this one thing. It's more of a cerebral exploration of the same themes at a different point in the timeline of the universe of the story. And you've provided the perfect transition into what I thought should be our next segment here. Let's just compare this book to the film. We did it on a chapter by chapter basis through the previous episodes when something would call out to us. I just thought it would be fun now to kind of look back and sort of think about how the book relates to the film. You've gone into it a little bit there spiritually, but I was thinking even the first thing that came to mind for me on this topic was sort of the shape of it. I mean, you already spoke about the idea that people wanted to see Tomorrowland. And I love that both in the movie and in the book, you're only seeing it to the degree that this story requires. And I love that both the book and the film are structurally these searches, something we're looking for. It's this road trip in the film. The book is not a road trip, but it is this sort of globe trotting.
City trotting is more like it.
Yeah, it is this city trotting adventure in which it's about the yearning for the idea of it. And so it allows, the inability to get there is the story. Like the inability to fully grasp it. Like, why is the future that we think should be so easy to imagine in this positive way, why is it out of our reach? And it's in watching the characters struggle with it that we have an example to follow in our own lives, because look, it's not going to be given to us either. Yes, it's fun. I honestly don't think there's a ton of purely utopian fiction that people successfully point to when they ask for a counterexample to this kind of storytelling, because usually there is a worm at the core of the apple. There always is some kind of trade-off. And so having the characters debate that, interpret that, have a bunch of different opinions on it. Like, honestly, the book ends up having a lot more characters than the movie did. So you get more angles on that. Again, the movie was much more of a fable and the book was much more of a pulp sci-fi novel. And so by that very difference, you're able to get, if the idea of Tomorrowland at the core is this gem, you're getting a look at the different facets of it through these different fictional lenses, and indeed just the difference between prose and cinema. You're going to have a different perspective on that as well. So yeah, it's just fascinating to consider these together when you divorce yourself from the idea of the traditional way you engage with a prequel. It's a much more, I don't want to say spirit, it's a much more thematic exercise than it is a literal exercise. And that's always so fun.
This robot human consciousness concept, which is clearly coming, right? And I think 10 years later, it feels way closer than it did 10 years ago. Programming versus humanism, and how we love and how we relate and what we do. And obviously other films like Her and others have explored this in other fashions. AI and things like character.ai, and like how young people are chatting with it more than humans, and like what's the human connection there, and like how do we make sure that there's a human connection? Because ultimately it's like, you think about how Athena was the whole film and how Frank loved her, and then you think about Henry and how even in this epilogue, it's like Henry still felt bad about the jokes about him killing her or whatever all those years later, right? It's that complex viewpoint of what is a human, what is a machine. It feels like if there's any time to discuss that idea, it's more now than it's ever been before.
You've just pulled out a very specific connection to the film that I didn't even notice till you said it. Both of them end with an artificial intelligence character dying after making a joke.
Yeah.
Athena makes her joke at the end, and Henry makes his last little to Amelia. There's all these little things, and I almost feel like the way that we went through this sort of chapter by chapter, there are probably other things that we didn't even pick up on this second time through. that we can rediscover in future years. And hopefully people listening to this, thinking about it on that level of comparing the two, can write into us with, and we can just learn more from everyone else's perspective.
I'm sure there's absolute parallels to the film that we didn't capture, and I would love to open up the inbox and and read about those. So absolutely send them in.
Some of the things we already sort of talked about as we went through the individual chapters, but I thought would be good to pull back here. Some of those characters that we've already discussed and how they relate, but more importantly, the character relationships, as I keep going back to how novel and interesting and compelling it is when you think about the core two human characters in each of these. So you've got Clara and Lee, and you've got Frank and Casey. And I just love the inversion of that. I love that the dreamer is the elder in the book and the dreamer is the youth in the film. It gives you both sides of that dynamic. And the book, I think the movie is giving you the prototypical version of that. You expect the elder to be jaded because he's lived through the horrors of life, the suffering that encompasses all of our lives. But to have the counterexample of that, it's complementary, but it's giving you the other side of it here with Clara and having her be the one that has to rein in the kid who is now tasked with sort of being the adult. I just feel like it's such a beautiful way to have a prequel story be told that enriches your appreciation of the film.
And that she could go through so much and still be the dreamer,
Yep. The dreamer who isn't just the dreamer. She's the dreamer that inspires others to be dreamers. And ultimately, that's where the film ends up as well. So it's harmonizing on all frequencies there. Hastin, I don't usually like to talk about, my favorite this, my favorite that. But look, we've done the epilogue. We've made it through the whole book. And I don't want to bog down our big celebration with this. So let's make it a little lighter. We've been getting deep with the themes. Let's just talk about some of our favorites here in the book. Dedicated favorites, and this is where we talk about them. Off the top of your head, do you feel like you have a favorite character at this point?
I mean, I think Amelia is my favorite character in the book. She's not dead, ragtag kind of like, I can just envision her the whole book. Like the fact that she's like head of security and head of like trying to wrangle all these men, all these crazy men that are just like, don't really know what they want, but also, know what they want. And it's just, she's just trying to make it all happen and deliver on it and whatever else in a world where society thinks she's dead. She's one of the most important people in society thinks she's dead. And I think that from a character perspective, maybe hers is the most fun from a just like, alternate history perspective.
You're so right. And we should clarify, favorite does not mean best. Because if we had to go like best written, best this, best that, we might answer something else. But honestly, Amelia is the one who came to me as well. And I was thinking about why. I agree with everything you said. The other thing that came to mind for me was when you dig into that idea of everyone thinks she's dead, I like this idea of carrying into my own life the concept of you can do the good work even if no one knows you're doing it. We can sometimes get distracted by sort of broadcasting all of our good deeds and wanting to make sure everyone knows that we're on the right side of this, the right side of that.
Especially in a main character era where like it feels necessary to broadcast your main characterness to the world.
Yeah. So to have this historical figure, everyone knows her name, everyone knows what happened to her, to have her now have this whole second life where that probably ends up, I mean, we don't know, but it probably ends up being longer than even the public life. And that she has an opportunity. Tesla says, you can go tell the world you're here. We'll deal with the fallout. And the fact that she chooses to stay with Plus Ultra and to do the good work, even if the world will never know. That is inspirational. And yes, she's a light, fun character, but I love that it's also got this core there of a very, very interesting way to exploit the kind of science fictional, like you said, alternate history of her character in a very interesting way. So yeah. Now, if I can't answer the same as you, I think we're speaking with one voice here, but if I can't answer the same as you, I'm just going to answer Faustus. No explanation. The Faustus units as one consciousness. Absolutely. And speaking of Faustuses, we've been talking a lot about AI. We've been talking a lot about the modern moment and then, sort of how science fiction has addressed AI. I would like to just give a moment of recognition that the thing that science fiction is generally talking about when we're talking about AI, the great AI characters throughout history, you mentioned her, Data from Star Trek, we think of Athena in Tomorrowland. That AI is not what we are now calling AI. The thing that we are calling AI in the public sphere, the idea of large language models, the idea of image generators, the idea of machine learning.
Right. Any sort of transformer model that we have now sort of labeled as the AI really is just, it's combinations of words with thinking that is combinations of words to produce more outputs of words that feel human to us as the way they are written.
And I'm not convinced that that is even going to be the lucrative or productive path towards creating an actual artificial intelligence. But I love that science fiction has leapfrogged over the logistics of that and allowed us to think about the sort of ethical questions, stories like Tomorrowland, surrounding AI, should it ever actually get here. But I just thought we should put a little pin in it that, like, the thing most people are telling you is AI. They're calling it AI so that they can raise capital, not because it's actually AI.
And I also think too that, if you look at, not to get too technical about it, but it's like if you look at these transformer models and what it is, right? They will get bigger, neural networks will get bigger. Like there is the potential to have some sort of breakthrough that is these neural networks get so big that they start to actually create connections that aren't just words that seem right after words. And so I do believe that maybe on some angle we are on sort of like not, probably not anytime soon, but that we are on this sort of like this weird precipice where a lot of this feels a lot more, and when you think about, we already have humans interacting with these things as if they are humans. And so even if they're not what they become, and science fiction has leapfrogged the technological details, maybe some people are treating it this way already, and they need to think about what they're doing and how these things aren't that.
It's going to be a fascinating thing to follow as these things emerged. But thankfully, we have had 100 years of wonderful science fiction to prime us for when the questions that need to be asked are going to get asked. Look at us. We can't even handle one question. We can't even handle one favorites without diving into one of these things.
Favorite quote?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I didn't have one that emerged independently on its own. And so I thought, well, if I have a favorite quote, it probably would be in these last 3 episodes of breaking down and summarizing the book. It would probably be one that jumped out enough at me at that time that I wrote it down in our notes. And so when I looked back through the last 3 parts of the book, the one that jumped out at me, I'm just going to say, this is my favorite quote. It must be. The evidence is right before me. This must be my favorite quote from the book. It was from chapter 25 at the World's Fair. And it's Tesla. We talked about it in the episode, but I'll reread it here. It's an incredible thing to have spent your life building a dream for mankind, then to have it snuffed out before man can even dream it. Was that yours too?
I am literally looking at that page right now, and I highlighted it in yellow when I was reading the book as one of my favorite quotes from this whole thing, because I feel like this quote for me summed up my entire experience with this film, interactive media that it created, the film itself, like how society interpreted it and whatever else. And I just felt like this particular quote to me felt like so much more than just what Tesla was saying. And this was written at a time when we didn't know the trajectory of this, and we didn't know the trajectory of, of where we were moving to.
That was written even before the pre-Star Cruiser closure disappointment chapter of our lives existed, and yet it feels so applicable to that.
I guess I have to pick another one.
If you've got one. If not, I'm just going to say, man, this is why we don't do favorites, because it's just us saying the same thing over and over again.
I really like this quote. Amelia, here's from Clara. A better future is something that we make, if not fight to make, every day. I'm prepared to fight for this. And it's so true. And I think I feel this, in our modern society, in this, a bit of this doomerism that exists today, and how there is a better future out there. And I think that individually, maybe we're tired and maybe whatever, but individually, I still think that, on a day-to-day basis, we do fight for it. And I think that it's easy to forget that we are fighting for, a future. Just making this and reminding people the humanism of the future and where we are and whatever else is fighting for it in a way. The individual actions that we take on a day-to-day basis, like we are fighting for that future that we have to make day after day after day after day. And
I love that you pulled that quote because you're right. That's the theme. That's the book. That's what we need to remember. And listening to you talk about it, the thing I'd add is simply it can be intimidating to talk about this and to think about this, to apply it to yourself and say, well, the city of the future is beyond. I'm not going to build the city of the future. That's not really where the metaphor is useful. It's like you said, in the big and the small ways. Like even like you said, just in the media you want to see in the world, in the stories that you want told. Like, look, it's a lot of work for us to sit down and do this podcast and to put it out and to edit it and to curate all of our notes and to re-examine things. But worse was the idea that this anniversary would go unnoticed and that this story would be forgotten. And so it's even if it's the smallest thing, you're right. I never thought about it that way till you said it, but it is my way of saying I want more of this kind of story in the future. And that might be the least significant thing you can do is to say no one's doing this kind of thing anymore. This kind of transmedia storytelling, this kind of interconnected thing, this kind of, really a distributed universe of narrative that's speaking with one voice on this level, where the author of one gets to be the author of the other. And it's not just hacked up for these different divisions to have their tie-in to release on the day the movie comes out. That can be entertaining as well. But I feel like you're right. Us sitting down to do this is us casting our vote and saying, we want this thing remembered because we want more of this type of thing. Even if we never get any more Tomorrowland media officially, the idea of other stories in other genres talking about other ideas, allowing themselves the ambition, the type of ambition that was on display of an original universe like this, of fighting to tell original stories in a world where people just don't support original stories. They talk about wanting original stories, but they don't support them. Tomorrowland was an example of that. And every weekend at the box office, we see examples of that because somehow people are still dragging themselves out and making original movies that people aren't going to see. So, every little thing that you do, every recommendation you give to a friend, person to person, that also makes an effect in the grand scheme of things. Now, do you have your favorite piece of Plus Ultra lore that we learned from this book?
I think my favorite piece of Plus Ultra lore is the Einstein-Tesla Impact Imbalance Act, established in 1928, the bylaw that prevents Plus Ultra development of any technology with the potential for producing equal or greater amounts of negative effect than positive effect, weapons and so forth. We used to use atomic bombs for interdimensional travel, but those are quite rough. I don't know. There's just part of me that, sums up the general sort of optimism and whatever of Plus Ultra by throwing this down and creating it. And I think adds a lot more impact into the movie that the modern day Plus Ultra that we see in the movie, what the horror that Nix has turned it into and has become, just straight up has weapons that liquidate, that just completely dissolve people and things.
Great point. I didn't even think of that detail when we talked about that in the previous episode. Fantastic. I'll do mine real quick because we did talk about it when it came up, but I don't remember the exact wording of it, but it was the idea when we learned that Henry was part of sort of the junior Plus Ultra recruit school.
Yeah.
Like the idea of there being that school for young recruits. And it wasn't just a thing, well, if you're not this old, you can't be a part of it. I love what that does for the movie. I love thinking about that. Athena and Frank being a part of that when they were growing up. I just, that small sentence had such great ramifications. And again, it could be a whole animated series. You could do that on Disney Plus, Disney Junior, the Athena and Frank at the Plus Ultra school, getting into shenanigans, flying jetpacks when they're not supposed to, and getting into really fun adventures would be absolutely fabulous.
With a healthy layer of STEAM learning right on top.
Oh, it would be so great. It would be edutainment is what it would be.
So favorite scene, did you have a dedicated scene that you loved from the book? Because I have mine, of course.
I didn't have a premeditated favorite scene. When I wrote down, let's talk about our favorite scenes, I didn't have one that jumped out. But when I sit and think about it as my standout favorite, again, this is not the best scene. It's emotional, but it's not, just an emotional thing. I just keep going back to the absolute insanity of that final battle in the hangar where all the Faustus units swarm and they're going up against the Apocalypse jumpers. And you do have character moments happening in the middle of this chaotic maelstrom of things going on, but the action is so inventive and so visually described against the internality of all these character moments.
Yeah, the Faustus units just hugging them because they have no other programming, so they just want to stop them by putting their giant arms around them. Oh, I love that so much.
So great. What about you? Did you have one that popped in?
It's that train ride as part of the sort of plus ultra experience, that hidden subway that they're riding that's completely empty. And I love this. My favorite way that was written was this duality of here they are absolutely panicking and are concerned and whatever else in this environment that was supposed to be extremely full, extremely comforting, ready to show them the future, ready to show them everything else. And here they are panicked to no end, just dealing with the noise around them. And like, and I don't know, there was just this duality of like what the experience was supposed to be and what they were experiencing in that moment and what had led up to it. It was just, that was my favorite scene.
And kind of, I'm sure, to a certain degree, unintentionally. I mean, I think it's intentional that the description of it kind of mirrors the transport hub that young Frank takes in the film. Step onto the platform and all that. But also, I think back to the finale of The Optimist when we're on the Lilybell train, and it's like, you have got the distance that this train is going on the track to solve the puzzle that's in the Lilybell, and the kind of relative chaos of that with the plus ultra narration. There was plus ultra narration playing on the loudspeaker. I didn't even think about that while I was reading it, but when you're describing it, I'm like, yeah, we kind of lived that too.
Yeah.
So finally here, our last favorite. Do you have a favorite station location?
The hover rail will be arriving in 1 minute. The hover rail will
it's biased for me. It's really biased for me because I just experienced it, but I have to say it's the Empire State Building. I mean, I was just there, a few weeks before reading the book and got to go to the very tippy top, that 108th floor observation tower, and ride up that center column, which only existed and I think the coolest thing to me was, hearing there, oh yeah, no, they were thinking about maybe this tall spire was going to be like a blimp station or whatever else. And then it was right in the book. Oh man, that was so much fun. And so I think that's favorite location station out of the book.
The scope of this story takes place pretty much within New York. We can't send people off to Tomorrowland, so a lot of these are going to be in New York. The one that stuck with me when I was like, what one did I like talking about the most? I feel like it was not even necessarily a location in the book, but adjacent to it, that Argosy bookstore that still exists. At the time Worldcon was going on, it still stood next to the venue, which is now no longer there. So we couldn't give you a location station for Worldcon, but the fact that there was this bookstore and, it was a literary science fiction convention more than anything else, that to me is just like, wow. Of the ones where we listed them out, next time I go to New York, that's the one I think I'm actually going to try and go to. Now, I was also thinking it might be fun for us to talk about the lingering questions that we have with the book. I'm sure there are dozens of little itty bitty ones, whatever, but when I was just saying, okay, what are the top ones? What are the ones that come immediately to mind? We were talking about The Optimist a little bit ago. Let's go back to The Optimist. Sorry for everyone who wasn't there, but hopefully we've talked about it enough that you have some idea of the story. There was a recruiter named Wallace. The game didn't explicitly say that he was a robot, but the fans, after seeing the movie, thought that guy was a robot, right? Do you think, Hastin, that Wallace was an escaped Faustus unit that was not incinerated?
Or whatever the version of the Faustus unit looked like during the fair? Absolutely.
You mean the 64 fair?
Yeah. I mean, maybe later than Athena time, but it definitely felt like there was this vintage mid-century charm to him. I know it's Disneyland, and Disneyland is very centered around mid-century, and so they were kind of playing into that, but I also think that given that came from him, it felt like he could have been one of those, whatever Faustus was at that sort of time period, it's like that was him.
It's an interesting question because Athena isn't the only recruiter at the 64 fair that we see in that scene, and it makes you wonder, are they all audio animatronics other than Nick's, or are these other Plus Ultra members? Are these Are these people who have been assigned to work at the fair? We don't really get to know that level of detail. This is the type of stuff we would know if they had made a visual dictionary for Tomorrowland, which, to be fair, is on my pet list of fan things we should do at some point, is to print out a visual dictionary for Tomorrowland. And, as a fan fiction, we could just guess.
Yeah,
just guess
absolutely.
which ones were robots and which ones weren't. The other one that came to mind, and again, we're going way in the weeds here. The relationship of the book to the film, what we learn about the founding, when the founding occurred, this idea of a meeting of the four minds at the World's Fair in 1889. And then you have Frank giving a very abbreviated backstory in the film when they reach the office where they met, top of the Eiffel Tower. Frank says,
French hated this thing when Eiffel first unveiled it at the Paris World's Fair. They thought it was an eyesore. Eiffel didn't care, though. It wasn't meant to be a monument. It was meant to find another world. Le Quatre Premiere. Plus Ultra's first four.
They were a part of all this?
Eiffel, Jules Verne, Tesla, and Mr. Edison. They designed this antenna that we're inside.
Wait, what? The Eiffel Tower's an antenna.
Now, I finally answer your question. You're going to interrupt me? Yes. Tesla designed the antenna to observe every kind of frequency out there. Subspace, transdimensional, you name it. And they found exactly what they were looking for.
but they were meeting at the World's Fair in the Eiffel Tower that is the antenna, and Plus Ultra had not been founded yet. So the question I ask you is, do you think there was a collaboration between Tesla and Eiffel that predated the founding? Or do you think there was an Eiffel Tower and it was retrofitted into an antenna once Plus Ultra was brought together?
I mean, if I had to take a stab at the concept, I think it's that Tesla, kind of like Frank in the movie, was able to sort of pirate this signal or something from the other world. And he knew it was already a thing. And he knew that Eiffel was building this massive tower as part of the World's Fair and said, hey, I want to collaborate with you and like stick something on it to see if I can get more of that signal and find out more about it. So I think, was there a collaboration? Potentially, let me do this thing. And then I also love thinking about the timeline of like, well, when did the rocket get put underneath it and it slid open and whatever else? Was that original? Was that fabricated later on? It's fun to think about.
You're right, because those two functions that they give two completely fictional functions to the Eiffel Tower that are not related to each other. The antenna that is receiving signals from another world and an escape rocket as a backup.
Right.
I love your solution is great though, because it actually gives you both, where it's like Eiffel designed the tower like he did in real life. The word of it got out. Tesla heard about it and said, hey, let's do something. So between announcement and build, they collaborated in the middle, and then it affected the final build of the Eiffel Tower. I like that idea. I like it. Hey, there we go. Headcanon acquired. It's been 10 years. We can make up whatever answer we want. Did you have any other lingering questions that you thought, when we consider what we know of Plus Ultra, any other last sort of, I'd love to know about that.
The grid was obviously destroyed as part of this, thing. It's like, did they recreate the grid? Was it built again? Like, was the technology, what changed in 30 years that allowed them to take the technology that was the grid and shrink it down to that little, transport bay that looked like a subway car? Like, what sort of changed there? And I think my lingering questions are like, what happened to the grid? And, I love this idea of thinking about the grid and how there's just this giant abandoned, electrical thing somewhere underneath the ocean, out in the middle of the ocean, just off of, New York. And like, cause it reminds me of like the decrepit things like at the fair site that are still there, like the old, fountains and whatever else with all the mechanicals and wires and things when the water level gets low that you can see that like haven't been touched for 60 years.
It's an interesting question because I think ultimately the question at the core of that is, was the grid going to be used in the 84 reveal? Because remember, they built the grid for this reveal, and 64 was not a reveal. In the film, Orson says, in 20 short years, we will share it with everyone. Was part of that sharing with everyone going to be grid 2.0? Because, shuttling 5-10 people, whatever, through the little subway thing you described, that's one thing. But getting the world access to it it would have required some other concept of the grid. So it's an interesting question.
And yeah, and like, when was the portal technology that, we see, the don't call it a portal, that we call in the film, like, when was that developed and invented?
It is a bridgeway.
Is that like a portal to Earth?
No, it is a bridgeway to Earth.
This has been so much fun to look back and to think about the epilogue in terms of what it means as a period at the end of a beautiful sentence that we have enjoyed so much. This is not the end, though, folks. Don't think that just because we've discussed all of the contents of the book that this series is over. We have one more episode because, remember, this anniversary comes up on the 7th of April when the book was released back in 2015. Now, we will have, next week, the finale of our book club. It's an anniversary special celebration, which will feature some behind-the-scenes look at the book's creation and a look towards its future and its legacy, which we look forward to sharing with all of you in 1 week's time. Meanwhile, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop us a line on Blue Sky or Instagram, or even send us an email at press@tomorrowlandtimes.com. That's PRESS at tomorrowlandtimes.com.
We'd like to thank everyone for visiting Tomorrowland Times, which we will keep alive as long as humanly, and maybe robotically, but humanly possible, to ensure that there is always a place where dreamers can stick together.
You heard the man. Let's get to work.